In the spring of 1942, the desert around Los Alamos did not look like the birthplace of anything extraordinary. It was dry, quiet, and indifferent. Wind moved across scrub and rock without pause, carrying dust that settled into clothes, hair, and lungs. There were no crowds, no monuments, no sense that history had chosen this place. That was precisely why it had been selected. J. Robert Oppenheimer arrived in New Mexico with a mind already fractured by urgency. He was thin, chain-smoking, restless, and brilliant in a way that unsettled people who preferred certainty. The war had turned time into an enemy. Germany was racing towards something no one fully understood, and the United States had decided, almost accidentally, that it could not afford to be second. The project did not yet have a name most people would recognize. It barely had a shape. What it had was fear. Physicists who had spent their lives arguing over equations were suddenly being asked a question that had nothing to do with theory and everything to do with consequence. Could the energy locked inside the atom be released all at once, violently, decisively? And if it could, who would do it first? Los Alamos was assembled in pieces. Scientists arrived with families who were told almost nothing. Letters were censored. Addresses were replaced with code names. The outside world faded as barbed wire and armed guards became normal. Inside the fences, a strange society formed. Nobel laureates stood in cafeteria lines. Young technicians worked beside men who had rewritten physics textbooks. Arguments erupted over chalkboards, then resumed over drinks, then continued late into the night in cramped offices where the smell of tobacco never fully dissipated. The work was relentless. They were trying to build something that had never existed, using materials that barely behaved, under conditions of secrecy that suffocated collaboration. Plutonium proved unpredictable. Uranium was scarce. Calculations had to be perfect because testing them would mean crossing a line no one could step back from. Oppenheimer held it together through force of personality rather than authority. He listened more than he spoke, then spoke with precision that cut through confusion. He absorbed anxiety from everyone around him and returned it as direction. Outside the laboratory, the world was burning. American soldiers were dying in places most citizens could not find on a map. Newspapers spoke in generalities. Radios delivered reassurance. Few people knew that in the New Mexico desert, the United States was preparing an answer so final it would redefine the meaning of war. As months passed, the scientists began to understand what success would mean. This was not a weapon like others. There would be no battlefield in the traditional sense, no gradual escalation, no possibility of misunderstanding the outcome. One device, properly assembled and detonated, could erase a city. Some tried not to think about it. Others thought about nothing else. By 1944, Germany's program had collapsed without producing a bomb. For a brief moment, relief flickered through Los Alamos. Then reality settled in again. The war was not over. Japan showed no sign of surrender. An invasion of the Japanese mainland promised casualties on a scale that made even hardened generals hesitate. The bomb, once an abstract fear, became an option. On July 16, 1945, before dawn, the desert witnessed something no human eyes had ever seen. At the Trinity test site, men lay on the ground miles away wearing darkened goggles, waiting. A countdown crackled through speakers. The final seconds stretched impossibly thin. Then the world changed. Light arrived before sound, before comprehension, before fear. The explosion rose into the sky, forming a pillar that seemed alive, boiling upward, expanding, rewriting the horizon. Heat washed over observers even at a distance. Silence followed, stunned and unnatural. Oppenheimer remembered a line from an ancient text, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." No one spoke for a long time. They had succeeded. They had also failed in ways they did not yet understand. Weeks later, President Truman authorized the use of the weapon. Hiroshima disappeared in a flash. Nagasaki followed. Japan surrendered. The war ended. In the United States, celebrations erupted. Soldiers came home. Factories retooled. The country exhaled. In the shadow of victory, the bomb settled into American life like a secret that could not be forgotten. Scientists argued over responsibility. Politicians argued over control. The military argued for expansion. The public oscillated between awe and unease. The atomic age had begun, and no one knew how to live in it. Los Alamos did not disappear after the war. It transformed. The temporary became permanent. Research continued. Weapons multiplied. What had been a desperate gamble hardened into doctrine. Deterrence replaced morality. Fear became strategy. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union raced to catch up. Espionage flourished. Trust evaporated. The bomb stopped being unthinkable and started being inevitable. For American citizens, the bomb entered daily life quietly. Duck and cover drills in schools, fallout shelter signs on buildings, films explaining survival in the event of nuclear attack. Children practiced hiding from a weapon that could erase cities. Adults pretended it made sense. The Manhattan Project was never dismantled. It simply dissolved into the structure of the modern world, into defense budgets, foreign policy, and the unspoken understanding that civilization now rested on restraint rather than innocence. Oppenheimer himself fell out of favor, questioned, marginalized, stripped of influence. The man who had helped unlock the universe's most violent secret became a liability in a world that demanded certainty, not reflection. The bomb did not end history. It froze it in place, balanced on a threat that has never been tested again. And somewhere in the New Mexico desert, the ground still carries a faint trace of glass where sand once melted under a light brighter than the sun. After the war, America did not slow down. It reorganized. Factories that had once produced tanks and aircraft converted to civilian goods almost overnight. But the logic of total mobilization remained. The country had learned something dangerous about itself. When pushed, it could bend science, industry, and human effort toward a single goal with terrifying efficiency. The bomb was proof. Washington no longer thought in terms of wars that ended. It thought in terms of balances that had to be maintained forever. The Atomic Energy Commission took control of nuclear research, wrapping it in layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. Decisions once made by scientists in chalk-filled rooms were now filtered through committees, generals, and politicians who spoke in acronyms and projections. Knowledge became compartmentalized. No one person was supposed to see the whole picture. But fear has a way of leaking. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb. The announcement landed in the American consciousness like a delayed echo of Trinity. The monopoly was gone. The future that had seemed controllable suddenly fractured into possibilities no one could calculate. The response was not restraint. It was escalation. Scientists were asked again to go further, to think bigger, to imagine weapons not measured in kilotons but in megatons. The hydrogen bomb, vastly more powerful than anything before it, moved from theory to inevitability with grim speed. Some refused to participate. Others told themselves they were preventing something worse. The logic was circular and airtight. If America did not build it, someone else would. If someone else built it first, America would be vulnerable. Vulnerability was unacceptable.
By the early 1950s, nuclear testing became routine. Explosions bloomed over deserts and oceans, recorded by cameras and instruments, analyzed like laboratory experiments. Mushroom clouds appeared in newspapers, then magazines, then films. The unthinkable became familiar. In Nevada, not far from Las Vegas, tourists watched tests from hotel rooftops. The ground shook, windows rattled, life went on. Downwind, people got sick. At first, no one connected the dots. Cancers appeared years later, livestock died, communities suffered quietly, without headlines. The bomb's legacy was not confined to enemy cities. It seeped inward, slow and invisible. Meanwhile, the Cold War hardened into shape. Berlin, Korea, Cuba, each crisis tested the limits of restraint. Each time, nuclear weapons hovered in the background, unseen but decisive. Leaders spoke calmly in public, while privately calculating how many millions might die if miscalculation became reality. The bomb was no longer a weapon of war. It was a weapon of non-war. American culture adapted in strange ways. Science fiction flourished, imagining mutants, wastelands, alien invasions. Anxiety disguised itself as entertainment. Civil defense films taught citizens how to stock shelters, how to wait out annihilation as if patience could substitute for physics. Children memorized procedures, adults memorized nothing and hoped for the best. The bomb shaped architecture, education, and psychology. Suburbs spread outward, cities decentralized, highways were justified as evacuation routes, universities received funding tied to defense research, knowledge and destruction grew together. Through it all, Los Alamos continued its work. New generations arrived, knowing the bomb not as a desperate wartime gamble, but as a permanent feature of national identity. For them, nuclear weapons were not controversial. They were technical problems to be solved, systems to be improved, safeguards to be refined. Distance softened conscience. By the 1960s, the United States possessed thousands of nuclear warheads. So did the Soviet Union. The world lived under what strategists called mutually assured destruction, a phrase so sterile it concealed its meaning. Peace maintained by the promise of total annihilation. And it worked. Barely. Crises came and went. Leaders aged. Ideologies shifted. The bomb remained, unchanged in its finality. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many Americans believed the nuclear age might finally loosen its grip. Warheads were dismantled, treaties were signed, optimism crept back into public conversation. But the infrastructure remained, the knowledge remained, and knowledge does not unlearn itself. Nuclear weapons spread to other nations. New tensions replaced old ones. The bomb, once a singular terror, became a background constant, less discussed, no less dangerous. For most Americans, it faded into abstraction, something managed by experts, something that existed elsewhere, until reminders surfaced, a declassified document, a whistleblower, a near miss revealed years later, an alarm misread, a radar glitch, a decision delayed by minutes that saved millions of lives without anyone knowing at the time. History, it turned out, had been closer to ending than anyone was comfortable admitting. Oppenheimer did not live to see the Cold War end. He died in 1967, cancer slowly undoing a body that once held the future together through sheer force of intellect. His legacy remained contested, his warnings quoted selectively, his doubts inconvenient. The Manhattan Project was never just about building a bomb. It was about crossing a boundary. Once crossed, there was no return to ignorance. Humanity had learned how to end itself, and learning cannot be undone. America learned this first, but not alone for long. Today, the desert at Trinity is quiet. Visitors walk the site occasionally, reading plaques, taking photographs. The ground looks ordinary. The sky is wide and indifferent, just as it was in 1945. Nothing there suggests that the world changed forever in a single instant of light. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. The most dangerous transformations do not announce themselves as endings. They arrive as solutions. And then they stay.
By the time the 20th century ended, the bomb had become background noise. It existed everywhere and nowhere at once. Warheads sat in silos beneath open farmland, guarded by young men who went home on weekends. Submarines moved silently beneath oceans, carrying enough destructive power to erase civilizations without ever surfacing. Strategic bombers flew training routes that crossed entire continents, their presence known only to radar screens and contingency plans. Nothing exploded, and that, paradoxically, was the point. For ordinary Americans, nuclear weapons were no longer something to fear actively. They were something to assume, like gravity, like weather, like death, unavoidable, but not worth thinking about daily. The Cold War ended without catastrophe, and a quiet belief settled in. If it hadn't happened by now, maybe it never would. That belief was comforting. It was also fragile. Inside secure rooms, far from public attention, simulations continued. Analysts modeled scenarios involving miscommunication, cyber interference, false alarms, human error. Each model ended the same way: devastation measured not in cities, but in systems, agriculture, medicine, governance, collapsing under stress they were never designed to survive. Yet these findings rarely left classified folders. The bomb demanded silence to remain useful. As the 21st century progressed, technology reshaped everything except the basic physics of nuclear weapons. Computers grew faster, communication became instant, social media collapsed distance and attention spans alike. Decision-making accelerated in nearly every domain. But nuclear strategy still relied on minutes. Minutes to assess, minutes to verify, minutes to decide whether a signal meant the end of the world or a malfunction. The margin never widened. New threats emerged, not from rival superpowers alone, but from instability, failing states, non-state actors, cyber intrusions that blurred the line between accident and attack. The systems designed in an era of rotary phones and paper logs now depended on digital infrastructure vulnerable to manipulation. The bomb had aged. Human institutions had not adapted at the same pace. Within the United States, debates resurfaced quietly. Should weapons be modernized, reduced, eliminated? Each argument ran into the same wall: uncertainty. No one could guarantee that restraint would be reciprocated. No one could prove that disarmament would make the world safer rather than simply less predictable. So, the status quo endured. Maintenance replaced innovation. Upgrades were justified as safety measures. Language softened. Budgets passed. The bomb stayed. Occasionally, it re-entered public consciousness through art or crisis, a documentary here, a film there, a foreign test launch briefly dominating headlines before attention drifted back to daily life. The real danger was not panic, it was normalization. Generations grew up knowing only a world where total annihilation was possible, yet postponed indefinitely. The absence of catastrophe began to feel like evidence of control rather than luck. Historians disagreed. They pointed out how often disaster had been avoided by chance, a misread signal corrected at the last moment, a commander choosing hesitation over protocol, a technical failure preventing an irreversible command.
These stories, when revealed, unsettled those who heard them. They suggested that survival was not proof of wisdom, it was proof of proximity to error. America's relationship with the bomb remained deeply personal and deeply impersonal at the same time. It was tied to national identity, scientific achievement, and global leadership. It was also something most citizens never encountered directly, never voted on explicitly, never saw. It existed above politics and beneath awareness. In classrooms, the Manhattan Project was taught as history, brilliant minds, urgent necessity, decisive victory. The moral complexity was acknowledged, then contained within discussion prompts and exam questions. The ongoing reality of nuclear weapons as a present danger rarely extended beyond the lesson. The past was easier to manage than the present. Meanwhile, the scientists who followed Oppenheimer inherited a quieter burden. They worked on safety mechanisms, verification protocols, early warning systems. Their goal was not victory, but prevention. They knew their success would never be celebrated publicly, only inferred from continued existence. Failure would be unmistakable. In private moments, some wondered whether the original sin could ever be absolved, whether humanity could carry such power indefinitely without eventually using it, whether the bomb was a temporary phase in history or a permanent condition. There were no answers, only stewardship. The desert at Los Alamos changed, too. What had once been an isolated mesa became part of a complex, regulated environment. Buildings replaced tents, security tightened, the work became less dramatic, more procedural. But the essence remained, the manipulation of forces that exceeded human scale. The ground still remembered. If one listened carefully, to the wind over the plateau, to the quiet hum of machines behind locked doors, there was a sense that something unfinished lingered. Not a weapon waiting to be used, but a question waiting to be resolved. Can knowledge be unlearned? Can restraint be permanent? Can a civilization built on innovation choose limits without crisis forcing the decision? The bomb did not answer these questions. It merely ensured they could never be ignored. And so America continued forward, carrying its most powerful creation not as a triumph, but as a condition, silent, heavy, and always present, like a shadow cast by a light too bright to extinguish.
The shadow did not grow darker. It simply remained. In the years after the Cold War's official end, American confidence shifted toward new threats: terrorism, economic instability, pandemics, dangers that felt immediate and visible. Nuclear weapons, by contrast, seemed old. They belonged to grainy photographs, Cold War rhetoric, and men long dead. The absence of catastrophe bred a subtle arrogance that the most dangerous chapter had already passed. But systems do not retire simply because attention moves on. Deep underground, missile crews continued their rotations. They learned procedures by heart, memorized codes, rehearsed responses they hoped never to execute. Their workdays were quiet, almost boring. The monotony was intentional. Emotion was a liability. Calm was a requirement. Most of them never questioned the mission. A few did. Those few learned quickly to keep their doubts private. The structure surrounding nuclear weapons left little room for reflection. Responsibility was distributed so thinly that no single individual felt ownership of the outcome. Orders arrived abstracted, justified by policy rather than morality. The chain of command existed precisely to prevent hesitation. And yet, hesitation had saved the world more than once. That paradox haunted the margins of the system. Occasionally, it surfaced through leaks and memoirs, retired officers admitting they had delayed a response, questioned a signal, trusted intuition over protocol. These stories rarely dominated headlines. They were too unsettling. They implied that civilization had survived not because systems were perfect, but because humans had quietly broken the rules. That was not a comforting lesson, so it faded. In the laboratories, the work continued under new names: stockpile stewardship, reliability testing, life extension programs. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to sound responsible rather than aggressive. No new bombs were being built, officials insisted. Existing ones were merely being maintained. The distinction mattered politically. Physically, it mattered little. Each upgrade extended the lifespan of a weapon originally designed for a world that no longer existed. Each simulation pushed computing power to model explosions that would never be tested again, yet could still be unleashed. The bomb endured by being rebranded as infrastructure. In popular culture, it drifted further into metaphor. Apocalyptic imagery became entertainment. Nuclear annihilation was stylized, abstracted, consumed as spectacle rather than feared as possibility. The distance between representation and reality widened. Americans laughed at the end of the world on screens. They slept peacefully beneath the real thing. Education adapted accordingly. Students learned about Hiroshima and Nagasaki as historical events, morally complex but resolved. The lesson implied closure. The bomb ended a war, then ushered in peace through deterrence. The ongoing presence of thousands of warheads felt like an epilogue rather than an active chapter. That framing was convenient. It allowed the story to feel finished. But history does not end when a story becomes uncomfortable. As decades passed, new generations of policymakers inherited authority over systems they did not design and doctrines they did not debate. Institutional memory thinned, assumptions hardened into tradition. The margin for improvisation narrowed. At the same time, technology accelerated decision-making everywhere else. Automation crept closer to command systems. Artificial intelligence promised speed and accuracy, raising questions no one fully wanted to answer. Should machines be allowed to advise, assist, or even decide in matters of nuclear response? The idea unsettled many. Progress demanded consideration, and consideration demanded time, the one resource nuclear strategy had never possessed in abundance. The bomb's greatest danger was no longer ideological confrontation, it was complexity, interlocking systems dependent on flawless communication in an imperfect world, layers of software and hardware built by different generations, maintained by contractors who would never see the consequences of failure. The more advanced the system became, the harder it was to fully understand. In this environment, confidence was a performance. Officials spoke publicly of stability and control. Privately, contingency planning expanded to include scenarios once dismissed as implausible: cyber interference, accidental escalation, regional conflict spiraling beyond intention. None of this was theoretical. History had already provided examples. They were simply inconvenient to remember. Los Alamos, quiet and secure, remained a symbol rather than a focal point. The birthplace of the bomb had become one node in a vast network of responsibility. No single place, no single person could claim authority over the whole. That diffusion was intentional. It was also dangerous. When responsibility belongs to everyone, it belongs to no one. And yet, the bomb still waited, patient, indifferent. It did not demand justification. It did not argue. It merely existed. A permanent option in a world that insisted it would never be chosen again. The most unsettling truth was not that the bomb could destroy civilization. It was that civilization had learned to live with that possibility without resolving what it meant. Not triumph, not failure, just acceptance. And acceptance, stretched across generations, hardened into silence. If the world ever ends in nuclear fire, historians will not point to a single decision or moment. They will trace a long line of normalization, of deferred responsibility, of quiet assumptions that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to postpone hard choices once more, until postponement is no longer possible, until the shadow finally moves and the silence breaks.